Before, before I have the great joy of introducing today's speaker, I'd like to make sure that we're all on the same page about the Washington State Death with Dignity Act. Initiative 1000 was passed in the November of 2008 election with more than a 57% majority statewide. It legalizes physician-assisted dying for terminally ill patients subject to certain restrictions. Competent adult Washington residents diagnosed with a terminal disease and with a prognosis of less than 6 months to live can request and self-administer prescribed lethal medication. There must be 2 oral requests to a physician given 15 days apart. 2 physicians must confirm the patient's diagnosis and competency. Physicians must also verify that this is an informed decision. Physicians, patients, and other provisions of the law include: the patient must be informed of all other options, including palliative and hospice care. After the 2 physicians have consulted with the patient, he or she must make a written request for the lethal medication. There must be 2 witnesses to the written request, at least one of which is not related to the patient or employed by a healthcare facility. The patient is encouraged to discuss with family, but this is not required. The patient may change their mind at any time and rescind the request. Once the law was passed, with all its procedures and restrictions, which you've just heard, what has been done to make it understandable and accessible to those qualified to use it? The organization that has taken on the responsibility for patient education and counseling is Compassion and Choices of Washington, one of the leaders of the coalition which sponsored Initiative 1000. CNC, as it's fondly known, had already worked for many years in end-of-life planning. At the time the law was passed, it had a staff and many trained volunteers ready to take the next step. Our speaker became one of these client support volunteers. It is with great joy and pride that I introduce my wonderful son to my beloved congregation. Chris Fruitrich will take the story from here and will also take questions after the service in the area over behind the piano.
Good morning. And thank you for having me in this community that I do so enjoy and admire. I just want to say, if there's a little hacking and coughing going on up here, I apologize, but a couple of weeks ago I was diagnosed with pneumonia. Who the hell gets pneumonia in a 90-degree heat wave? This guy. I am a lifelong Unitarian, at least in theory, and have joined this community off and on since the mid-1950s. Mostly off, I'm afraid. So it's wonderful to be with you this morning, talking about the uplifting topic of death. I'm not the Grim Reaper, nor Dr. Kevorkian, but a simple volunteer helping terminally ill people who wish to take advantage of Washington's Death with Dignity Act. I work with the group called Compassion and Choices of Washington, already noted. The same dynamic life force who drove me to the church in the 50s and introduced me today, I call her Mom, helped nurture in me a belief that everyone on this good earth deserves a heaping helping of dignity every day, and that goes for their life and for their death. It was that belief and a series of sad experiences with terminally ill friends that led me to this calling. Thoughts of a dignified death first came to life for my wife and I when a dear friend of ours in Washington, D.C. was struck with metastasized breast cancer. We helped her as she grew weaker and visited her in the care facility. One night, late into her disease, we watched as a young man came into the room and typed a code into her drip line, administering a prescribed dose of morphine. A few minutes later, he stopped back in to see how she was doing. "I'm still in a lot of pain," Jan said. "Could I have another dose of morphine?" The man looked at his watch, shook his head, and said, "Not for another 6 minutes." Then he turned on his heel and walked out the door. I followed him into the hall and asked, "Why the heck can't you help control her horrendous pain?" He said simply, "I have to put my personal code into that box every time she gets morphine. If they see I've done it too often, I could lose my job." 2 days later, in and out of pain, Jan died. Her caregivers, a for-profit organization, allowed her no dignity in those final days as she begged for relief from her pain. A few years later, another very close friend was struck with mesothelioma. As the disease slowly gained the upper hand, he struggled and struggled to fight it. However, in the end, he was a 64-year-old man under the haze of strong painkillers, wandering his home in only an adult diaper with little idea of who was around him. These two people lived good lives. They deserved good deaths. Neither may have chosen death with dignity, but it should have been a choice for them. That thought drew me to the idea that for some, our state's death with dignity law was a welcome way to prevent a terminal disease from stealing their dignity. When I learned that Compassion and Choices of Washington needed volunteers, I volunteered. That was 2 years ago. For a little context, between 2009, when the law first became effective, through 2014, 485 people took their lives through the use of the death with dignity law and the lethal medication. 238 more people received their medications, but either chose not to use them or died before they could. Compassion and Choices assisted 79% of all those death with dignity cases since the law went into effect, including 96% last year. In addition to help with death with dignity, Compassion and Choices of Washington aids with all end-of-life decision-making, from how to speak to your family and your doctor about the end, to filling out those all-important advanced medical directives, something I recommend for anybody over the age of 18. I do have some brochures with me, and as noted, I will happily take questions when we're done here. That's the end of the commercial portion of this presentation. My Death with Dignity ride has been remarkable and is littered with stories writ large and small, funny and sad, uplifting and frustrating. I'll tell a few of them and hope they give you some insight into the law and how it's been used. The first I like to call the poster child for the people who really need the law. One of my early clients was a 72-year-old woman with pulmonary fibrosis. For those of you who don't know, that's a disease of the lungs, which slowly grows and consumes a larger and larger portion of the area that is supposed to take in oxygen. Her choice, basically, was going through something worse than waterboarding over the final weeks of her life, or die on her own terms. She chose death with dignity. On the appointed day, as always, I arrived at least an hour early, gave her 2 anti-nausea pills, and let her family have the last moments with her. When it came time for the medication, I went up to the room, and everyone was talking at once. What do we do next? Who gives her this? Who gives that? Where do we do? Her response was to the entire family, "Be quiet. The only person I want to hear from now is Chris." So she took her medications, sitting up as requested, lay down on her right side, as requested, and quietly went to sleep. Her husband stayed upstairs with her while her daughters and I went downstairs to wait. While we were waiting, one daughter asked me, "How did you get into this business?" So I had to tell her about my FDR Socialist Democratic mom that led me to this place. As I was leaving, the husband told me how at ease the family felt to have someone like me with them. One of the daughters walked up and hugged me and thanked me for all the help. And then the other daughter burst out of the kitchen, gave me a big hug, and said, "And please, thank your mother." The Type A party. One of my clients was a 72-year-old woman with various cancers and a super Type A personality who wanted to control every aspect of her death. We'll call her Susan. There were people at the house, probably 30. There was music. There was catering by someone called the Paella King. And the big desire for her was not to face death lying down. So that said, she sat on the couch with two friends on either side, determined to sit up through the entire thing. I gave her medication. We chased it with a little honey to get rid of the awful taste, which we'll discuss later. She sat for a few minutes, then her head slumped forward, and a friend across the room started to cry. At that moment, Susan's head popped up, and she exclaimed, "Hey, I'm not dead yet." Then she did. Slowly, the medication took over, and she went to sleep. And her breathing became very labored. For a while, when you're sitting up, your whole respiratory system is assaulted by the medication, which is largely a huge dose of barbiturate. At times, it sounded like she was being strangled. Every eye in the place was on me, and I was trying hard to remain calm. Finally, I convinced the group that, gosh, she's asleep, and I think it would be okay if we lay her down. She did lay down, and she died about 15 minutes later. The uninformed. You would think that an issue as large as death with dignity, and that got as much publicity as Initiative 1000 did, that would be pretty universally understood, particularly in places where it's important. But we had an occasion in a rural county, excuse me, where if you're not on hospice, and a hospice nurse can't call to verify that this was a planned death, the volunteers are obliged to dial 911, and authorities come out to see what happened and to authorize the body to be moved to the funeral home. In this particular case, we got an extremely aggressive policeman and two large paramedics all at once at the door. The paramedics immediately burst through the door and said, "We're going to go resuscitate." The policeman wanted to ask questions about the situation and so forth. And in charge that particular day was Gretchen, who at the time was our coordinator of volunteers. Now, Gretchen stands about 5'2" and wouldn't weigh 100 pounds unless she jumped off the sink onto the scale. She stood up in front of these guys and tried to explain death with dignity. None of them had heard of it. None of them had heard of it. But we managed to slow them down long enough that they were able to call the station and confirm that such a thing actually did exist, and the person was allowed to die with her dignity. Another uninformed couple, two of us went out on this particular call because one of the fellows was assigned and he was going to be on vacation, so I went as a backup. And we got to the house and we talked a lot about questions about death with dignity and how long it takes and what you need to do. And finally, I asked the husband or wife which one of them had received the terminal diagnosis. They looked at each other and looked back at me and said, "Neither." The wife finally admitted, after a little cross-examination, that they were both frightened to death of the medical system. And they wanted to have the medication on hand in case there was an emergency, so they could both drink it and be gone before the medics got there. We strongly recommended that in lieu of that, they set up some advanced directives, get a health care advocate, and after a half an hour or so of discussion, they agreed to do that. On my very first training visit, and we do go through quite a bit of training before we are turned loose on the Death with Dignity world, we walked in the door, and the very first thing that our client said is, "You got my pill?" Well, we had to explain to him that it's not just a pill. I have a hunch he was watching too much James Bond, and that the process was a bit more involved than simply calling Compassion and Choices and swallowing a pill. So we explained the process. He understood. He wanted to get on board. We got everything moving in the right direction. And as we were about to leave, we saw he was sitting, casting a longing look at his chair, and said he wanted to die in that chair, looking out the window at his view, but he knew he couldn't. So we asked, "Why not?" And he said, "Well, I know when you die, you poop all over, and I want to save this chair for my son." Well, no, you don't poop all over. The Death with Dignity, you basically get a large dose of medication, and you simply go to sleep. It's a very peaceful event. Ultimately, he did die unconvinced and not in his chair. Excuse me again. I always like to visit my clients well in advance of the time that they choose to take their medication. There's lots of things that need to be gone over. And in one case, I received a call, and I returned the call to the husband of a terminally ill woman who told me, heck, they were all set, they got their medication, they take their doctors, everything was ready to go. Then 2 days before the scheduled event, he called with a note of panic in his voice. Gosh, there may be a thing or two that I hadn't thought about. So I agreed to go out and meet them. So I did. And when I got there, I discovered there was no arrangement for a funeral home. They didn't know what order the medication should be taken in. They didn't realize that someone had to inform the medical examiner. So I spent 2 hours with them, made the appropriate calls, then went back the next day, and we had a very smooth and peaceful death. Everything went smoothly, and I had a new best friend in Spanaway. Then there was one of my favorites, a woman who used to supervise a room full of men at the Department of Defense. Very hard-nosed and ready to get things done her way. I went out to her home on the day that she was going to take her medication. We had planned for about a 3 o'clock time. We didn't actually get it done until after 7. The day went something like this. Are we ready? Well, I have some things at my desk that I want to show my sons to make sure that they know what's going on. So it was over to the desk and working at the desk. And then, Chris, you know what I would really like? A cigarette. This from a woman with COPD and congestive heart failure. She had a cigarette, came back feeling quite good. Back to the desk. Then you know what was a good idea? Another cigarette. Then more desk work. Then another great idea, another cigarette. Finally, we exhausted all of the cigarettes, and we're getting ready to take the medication. I had explained to her in my first visit that patients normally go to sleep in 3 to 5 minutes after she takes the medication. So we went up to her bedroom where she wanted to have it administered. I handed her the glass with the medication. She looked at me very hard in the eyes and said, "Now I still get that 3-minute deal, don't I?" She did. She went to sleep in 3 minutes and died in about a half an hour. Waiting too long. This is a problem that unfortunately happens far too frequently. I've had several clients who got the medication but lost the ability to take it due to losing their decision-making to dementia or the need to take massive doses of painkiller, which renders them basically unable to make the decision. I volunteered for one client, called and set up an interview for the next day, and when I arrived at the house, discovered that the woman had died as I was on my way over there. And something I hear over and over again: I feel pretty good right now, so let's wait a while. But then the disease shows up like a bolt out of the blue, takes over and steals any chance they have to actually complete the process and get the medication and have a death on their own terms. When clients die before I can help them, I take it very personally. I came to calling it the FOC syndrome, the fear of Chris. I might point out that we use two different medications now. One is a very powerful barbiturate that's been on the market for years, and the other is a cocktail of 3 drugs which act much in the same way. The longtime barbiturate that we've used now costs more than $3,000 after its rights were sold to a Canadian company that more than doubled its price. The other, newer medication costs about $500. We had a standard, much less expensive medication for years that was used until some ham-handed executioners in some of our, well, let's say southern states, botched their assignment. The distributor, which is a European company, just flatly stopped all distribution of the medication in the U.S., even after our considerable appeals on humanitarian grounds. In any event, all of the lethal medications we take taste awful, really, really awful. We have tried everything from Tutti Frutti to marshmallow and combinations in between, but there's nothing that can cut through the bitterness. Despite the fact that I always warn them many, many times, when it comes to time to take the drink, I see some of the most contorted faces this side of the funhouse mirror. As one client said, "I hope this works because I'm not taking this crap again." It's really not that easy. Despite my somewhat flip attitude at times here, you should know that this is not an easy thing to do over and over. This does involve the end of someone's life, and though we and they both know it's for the best, sometimes it just gets a little heavy. Not long ago, I had 3 deaths in a span of 8 days. After the third one, I left the people's house, drove to the end of their long driveway, and when I got to the main road, I could not remember for the life of me where I was, which way I should turn, or how the heck I was going to get home. It took a lot of deep breaths, a healthy dollop of self-assurance, and finally I turned left, which was correct, and made it home without any further incident. It really is only through the support of the group and my wife, who sees plans uprooted and days interrupted by client visits, that helps me keep going. And I really believe in it. And one of the reasons I really believe in it was what I call the way to go. My very first assignment as the lead volunteer with a 64-year-old man right here in Tacoma who had multiple cancers and congestive heart failure. I had been to talk to he and his partner. We'd gotten it all set up. He gave me the date that he wanted to go and the time. So when I arrived at the house, imagine my surprise. There were at least 45 people there. There was music. There was food, really good brownies. And the client was in the middle of the living room in his wheelchair with his oxygen up his nose, holding court, telling stories, listening to stories, having a ball. About 5 o'clock, his partner came, gave him his anti-nausea medication, and he stood and continued to hold court. And right at 6, he wheeled his wheelchair into his downstairs bedroom, crawled into his hospital bed, called his 5 dogs, and they all jumped up on the bed and lay around him in a big circle, and took his medication at 6 o'clock sharp. He chased the medication with, once he was in bed with his dogs, he invited everyone to come and say goodbye one last time. People trooped through, came out, and some laughing, some crying. And he took his medication and chased it with a shot of $500 scotch, which he and his pals had thrown in together for this very occasion. He sat down, or leaned back in his bed, started to tell another story, and the story got slower and slower and slower, and finally he went to sleep and died very quietly. He was a popular neighborhood gardener. He was cremated, and this spring, his partner mixed his ashes with the soil in the backyard, which is quite a remarkable piece of landscaping. He was smiling throughout the whole day, definitely maintained every ounce of his dignity. And that's sort of the story from start to finish, and we continue to do it now. I have several clients who will be taking their medication sometime in the next month, and we will continue to do this as long as we're able. Thank you very much. And again, questions after we're done today. Thanks.